This presentation was recorded at the 4th Annual Nutrition and Health Conference in San Diego, California.
And I'll be your moderator for the next few hours. The topic for our conversation today is good food, from the personal to the global. And this is a part of the annual conference on nutrition conceived by Dr. Andrew Weil and his program in integrative medicine. Over the next 2 hours, we're going to have first a dialogue on the personal. Dr. David Wallinga, who's here with us, Michael Pollan, and Andy Weil and I will be discussing sort of what to eat now and how, very much on the personal side of it. In the second hour, we're going to introduce a couple of more speakers who are going to come up and join us, and we're going to talk about the politics and policy of food, really moving into the macro issues that we need to talk about. Many of you have registered online and sent in your questions, so we're going to be using those to help guide our dialogue tonight. And my hope is that you leave with some provocative thoughts to bring back and share at your dinner table and have some things you can do to make a change in your life towards eating well. With that, let me introduce my colleagues. First up, Dr. Andrew Weil is the best-selling author and renowned expert on integrative medicine. He's the founder and director of the program in integrative medicine at the University of Arizona's Health Science Center. Many of you know his website, drweil.com, or have seen him on Larry King Live or on the cover of Time magazine. His most recent book is Healthy Aging, a lifelong guide to your physical and spiritual well-being. Earlier books have included 8 Weeks to Optimum Health and The Healthy Kitchen, Recipes for a Better Body, Life, and Spirit, co-written with Oprah Winfrey's former chef, Rosie Daly. Next up is Michael Pollan. Michael is the author most recently of The Omnivore's Dilemma, A Natural History of 4 Meals, which is a New York Times bestseller. His previous books are The Botany of Desire, A Plant's Eye View of the World, A Place of My Own, and Second Nature. He's a contributing writer to the New York Times Magazine. Michael's a recipient of numerous awards for journalism, including the James Beard Award for the Best Magazine Series in 2003 and the Reuters 2000 Global World Award for Environmental Journalism. And finally, Dr. David Wallinga, Director of Food and Health Program at the Minneapolis-based Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. David's work focuses on ecological health context for how we grow, process, and distribute foods. He focuses on how we grow food, its impact on public nutrition, and the impact on the environment in which we live. We're going to start this evening with Andy providing some comments and setting the table for us in this first part of the discussion.
Thank you, Tara. Good evening and welcome. This is a public forum attached to the 4th Annual Conference on Nutrition and Health, State of the Science and Clinical Applications that we have put on in association with Columbia University. The first 2 conferences were in Tucson. Last year's was in New York. This year's is here, and we intend to grow this and move it around the country. The purpose of the professional conference, which attracts mostly physicians, nurses, nurse practitioners, registered dietitians, clinical nutritionists, and other health professionals, and is given for continuing education credit, is to get these professionals up to speed on nutritional science and its clinical relevance. I think there's a tremendous need for this, and let me set the stage by talking about that need. In my medical education, 4 years at Harvard Medical School and a year of internship, the total instruction that I got in nutrition was 30 minutes, which were grudgingly allowed to a dietitian at one hospital I worked at in Boston to tell us about special diets we could order for patients. That has not changed substantially since I've been out of medical school. If there were deans of medical schools in the audience, they would be jumping up and down as I say that and pointing to their curriculums. But what they teach in my book is not practical nutrition. It looks like biochemistry, and it's mostly forgotten as soon as biochemistry exams are over. I would maintain that the medical profession in our country is functionally illiterate in nutrition, and that has terrible consequences. One of them, an obvious one, is the utterly abysmal food that is served in our hospitals and medical centers, which should be a national scandal. Another is that medical doctors, unless they have made an effort to get out and learn and make up this deficiency in their education, are unable to advise patients or even answer the most simple questions about, is it better to eat butter or margarine? Is olive oil okay? Is it okay to take beta-carotene as a dietary supplement? And there's a further problem that if doctors want to remedy this deficiency in their education, until this conference was started, there was not even a venue for them to go to get this kind of continuing education. It's astonishing how always nutrition is given short shrift in medical education. I mean, it's so counterintuitive, it's so irrational. It's obvious that how we eat is one of the cornerstones of health, and dietary patterns have clear correlations with patterns of health and illness. You know, why is this so consistently neglected? My answer to that is that to the academic medical mind, and I'm tempted to say to the male academic medical mind, nutrition looks like home economics. It is not as real a subject or as important as biochemistry or pharmacology, and it's always shoved to the bottom and neglected. One of the things that one of my missions through the program in integrative medicine is to try to emphasize the paramount importance of nutrition education in the training of health professionals, and to help bring into existence a field of nutritional medicine. And this field has two main thrusts to it. One is to really think about what is an optimum diet. What are the generalizations that we can make to give people about how to eat in order to increase your chances of maximum longevity and optimum health throughout life. Being aware that there are individual differences in physiology and biochemistry and so forth, but what are the generalizations we can make? And the second thrust is how can we use dietary change as a primary therapeutic strategy? This is something that we do in our clinic, and we encourage all the doctors that we train to do, is that before you think about giving pharmaceutical drugs, before you think about doing procedures, what can you do? It's simply with changing patterns of eating. How can you use dietary change as a primary treatment? I have seen enormous success with this in my own personal private medical practice. I see this in our clinic. I see this again and again. I mean, just as one example, I cannot tell you how many patients over the years have come to me with chronic sinus conditions, some of whom are veterans of 7 sinus surgeries with no relief. And they have been dependent on endless cycles of antibiotics, steroids, and I tell them to just try to see what happens if for 2 months you completely eliminate cow's milk and cow's milk products from your diet. That means reading labels to make sure you're not getting anything with casein, the milk protein, or non-fat dry milk. A very high percentage, I would say something in the range of 80 or 90% of these people, when they do that, have great relief. Often to the point that they can stop using medications. And then their first question is, why didn't a doctor tell me this? Well, a doctor can't tell you that because the doctor didn't learn it. There are so many examples of this kind of thing, and this is what I mean by using dietary change as a primary therapeutic strategy. A third disastrous consequence of the functional illiteracy in nutrition of the medical profession is that it is unable to stand up as a powerful social and political counterweight to government stupidity and corporate greed, which is driving our population to make wrong food choices. We are, in case you haven't noticed it, in dire nutritional straits in this country. The epidemic of childhood obesity being followed closely by an epidemic of type 2 diabetes, which will be followed certainly by an epidemic of coronary heart disease in young men, something we've never seen before, because diabetes experts say that the cardiovascular consequences of type 2 diabetes develop about 10 to 15 years after diagnosis. So we can expect to see an epidemic of coronary heart disease in men in their late 20s and early 30s based on what we're seeing with childhood obesity. This will be entirely of our creation. I'll just give you one example. I said this in our professional conference. A couple of years ago, I was asked to be the after-dinner speaker one night at the obesity summit that was held in Williamsburg, Virginia, sponsored by Time Magazine and ABC News. It got a lot of publicity. I sat through one day of the conference, and I was very offended at some of the things that I heard there. The federal government, which sent a number of representatives, pushed very hard the line that obesity in this country is entirely a matter of individual responsibility. This is when the then Secretary of Health and Human Services, Tommy Thompson, said that the answer was for Americans to do sit-ups in front of the television during commercials. How can the federal government say that its hands are clean in this matter when if you go into a supermarket in this country, the cheapest calories that you can buy are all of the low quality carbohydrate foods, all of the snack foods, all of the chips, all of this stuff, a lot of it containing soy oil, which is one of the worst products that has been released into the food chain, a major source of pro-inflammatory fatty acids. Well, we can talk more about this later. And the universal sweetener in these products is high fructose corn syrup, I think an unalloyed dietary evil, which I will be happy to talk more about. And the reason these are cheap is because federal subsidies artificially drive down the prices of these crops of soy and corn, whereas the most expensive calories you can buy are fruits and vegetables because there are no federal subsidies to these crops. I also sat through a panel of the chief PR spokespeople for Nestle's, Kraft, McDonald's, and Coca-Cola. And to listen to these people, you would think these were health food companies. You know, their line is we're just giving people what they want. And they see no responsibility on their part to try to change tastes or to move tastes in a better direction. So I think there is the issues that I hope we will be able to discuss here today have to do with the consequences of our food choices, the way eating patterns have changed drastically in this country over the past 50 years, and the bottom line there is the extent to which artificial, manufactured, processed, and refined foods have displaced whole natural foods from our diets. This is a dramatic change in eating patterns, unprecedented in human history. The products of modern food technology almost invariably reduce the nutritive qualities and increase the dangerous qualities of the natural raw materials that they start with. And the extent to which we are now consuming these things and the reasons we're doing so, which have a lot to do with policy and with economics, with money, as you'll hear from many of our speakers, are huge issues. There is an opportunity this year to try to change some of that because these policies are determined every 5 years in the Farm Bill, and this is the year that a Farm Bill is being created. And I have to say that at our first conference in Tucson 4 years ago, I heard Michael Pollan talk about the Farm Bill and how it influenced our eating habits, and I was shocked because I thought I was somebody who was fairly with it, with nutritional issues and science. I had no idea of the influence of the Farm Bill on crops, on food, on people's eating choices. And he said one statement that I quote and that I always remember was that if the Farm Bill were called the Food Bill, more of us might sit up and take notice that it affected us and not just the lives of a few people in Iowa. And this is in fact the case. So especially in the latter part of this program, we will talk about food and farm bill politics and how you can be involved in trying to change some of these policies that have had disastrous consequences for our population. So that's what I have to say.
So how many of you have read Michael's latest book, The Omnivore's Dilemma? Pretty good number. I read it, and I have to say, Michael, the first question is for you because I'm a foodie. I love a good meal, but I have never been inspired to hunt a wild boar or to go into the belly of the industrial food industry and find out what happened. So I'm so curious, what drove this odyssey for you, and what are your observations from it?
Is this microphone working? There's another. There we go. Good. Well, I did shoot and eat a wild boar. It's true, and I also went to McDonald's, and that kind of bookended the story for me. What I was trying to do in the book was answer a very simple question that's become very complicated, which is what should we eat? And I thought to do that, I needed to, before I could answer that question, I had to answer what should have been an even simpler question is, well, what am I eating? Because you realize that the provenance of a lot of our foods has become quite obscure and hard to follow, and that the food industry works very hard to keep it that way. So I decided to follow some food chains, basically, from the farm to the plate. And so I looked at the industrial food chain, which begins with a McDonald's meal and took me to some surprising places, but all of them ultimately converging on a farm field in Iowa, where a field of corn and soy, and as Andy pointed out, the building blocks of the industrial food system and of the fast food nation that we've become, in Eric Schlosser's terms, are those cheap commodities, corn and soy and wheat, and most processed food is essentially very clever rearrangements of the molecules that can be derived from that. But I also wanted to look at some other food chains, and so I looked at the organic food chain, which I realized was two food chains. It was the industrial organic food chain, food you could buy at Whole Foods, with asparagus from Chile and strawberries from Mexico and chicken from Northern California, and then I looked at a local food chain. And then finally, and the reason to come back to your question is I was very interested to reconnect with my food as directly as I could, and to make one meal in this book that was something that I had hunted, gathered, and grown myself. I had never hunted. I don't come from hunters. I was really ill. I had never fired a gun. So that was quite a challenge for me. But also I went mushroom hunting and grew some food, and we went and tried to gather salt in San Francisco Bay. I tried to make it a meal that was entirely self-made. And not because I think that that's a solution to the dietary problems. It's more of an educational process. I mean, we really need to be reminded who's feeding us. It's not Kraft and McDonald's and Coca-Cola. It's nature. Even in those cases, it's the natural world. It's this amazing set of species we depend on that we've narrowed to these big 2 or 3, but in fact once was 80,000. And so, it's nature that feeds us. So I wanted to kind of delve back into that world, and that's why and I also, if I was going to eat meat, I felt once in my life I had to see how I felt about, facing the animal and killing it and cleaning it, and did I still want to eat meat after that was the question.
So that's a perfect lead-in for me, because I have to say I normally read books about food at night in bed. That's where I read that. Not business books, but food books are in bed. And your book terrified me, I have to say. I mean, I would have anxiety going to bed reading this book, and I kept thinking, I can eat less and less. The more I read the book, the less there was for me to eat. And then I watched your dialogue with John Mackey from Whole Foods online, and he showed a really interesting and aggressive film about animal husbandry as part of the dialogue. And at the end of it, I thought, my God, there's nothing left for me. What am I going to eat? And I think for me, the number one question for tonight for all of you is what to eat. Did any of this process encourage you to become a vegetarian or a vegan? Did it make you question your issues? And how did you fall out on it? And Andy and David, from your perspective, sort of, how do you make some of these choices? How do you think about this as you're realizing how difficult the challenge of what to eat is?
Well, I am still eating. I haven't given it up. I have given up a lot of things, however. And I think the part of the story you're describing that was kind of harrowing to me too was following a steak, essentially, from insemination of the cow to slaughter of the steer, and learning how the modern meat is made. And that is enough to put you off your feet. It's not a pretty picture in many, many ways, but not all in the ways you'd think. I mean, there is the animal cruelty, which is part of the process, but a lot of it is seeing what the animals eat and what they eat does to them and does to us. And so to really follow the industrial meat food chain was transformative for me. And when I wrote about that, I initially wrote about that in an article in the Times Magazine in 2002. I kept running into people who said, well, I stopped eating meat. I'm a vegetarian now. But I did not. I did not come out there. Where I came out, and I was sort of surprised but pleased too that I hadn't programmed the response to the article. But that people can draw very different conclusions from what I write about how they eat. And I try very hard not to tell people what to eat, but just kind of help them think about it. So I did give up industrial meat. I don't eat feedlot meat. But the great thing is, though, and this is where I think the premise of your question is wrong, is that there are incredibly good alternatives out there now, and more all the time. There's a lot of good news going on in food, at the same time that there is this cascade of problems. But there is, for example, over the last 5 years, a flourishing of a market for grass-finished beef. And grass-finished beef is a completely different product than industrial meat in every way. And that, to me, that is it's actually one of the more sustainable things we can eat. And it's, its health, its value as a food is much superior than feedlot meat. One of the things we often forget is that we think an egg is an egg and a steak is a steak when we're working through all these things. But there are enormous qualitative differences. One of the things I learned in how something is grown and how the animal is raised, what that does to the final product. And we're learning, the science is really coming in now on this to show that there are real nutritional differences if you grow produce in really good soil. And well-grown produce is not the same. An egg that came from a chicken that got to eat green things in its life is just not the same food. And that's one of the reasons it might cost 5 times as much per egg, but it's actually not comparable in terms of quality. And the same is true for meat. What you feed the animals has an enormous bearing on the quality of the animal's life and the quality of the food. So one of the things that I became in my own eating, and we can get more or less specific about it if you want, is that I pay a lot of attention to where food comes from. And certainly in the case of eating meat or fish or chicken, what the animals I'm eating ate themselves. There's a line I used in the book that took me the longest time to parse, and I don't know if it works spoken, but we all heard you are what you eat, but you're also what you eat eats. So you have to digest that. It's kind of a koan of food.
Yeah. No, please jump in.
Let me just make one comment. Michael said it's important to find out where your food comes from. This is another issue that will be decided in this year's Farm Bill. There are powerful interests that do not want you to know where your food comes from and resist having food labeled as the country of origin. So this is an issue that you can all be involved in writing your legislators, and you'll hear more about this from our other 2 speakers. I think it's very important that we demand that we know where our food comes from.
That's right. I totally agree with that. That's something called country of origin labeling, and it seems like such a simple concept just to know where something you're buying at the supermarket originated. And in fact, in European supermarkets, in some cases, when they pass the item over the scanner that looks at the barcode, it can bring up a picture of the farm. And it gives you a really good image. Tara, I want to respond to your question, too, about food choices. I haven't found that it's made choices scary. In a lot of ways, my choices have gotten more enriched. There's better stories with where I get my food now. I got a quarter hog delivered last week by Dwight Peterson. So Dwight is a Nyman Ranch pork farmer in southeastern Minnesota. And among their customers are Chipotle. And it's said that Chipotle supports 2 hog farmers like Dwight every time they open up a new store. So, that's a great story that I'm able to visit his farm if I want to. The eggs that I sometimes get are from a couple of nuns in central Minnesota. They feed flaxseed to their chickens. And not only are they great tasting, but the yolks are an incredibly brilliant orange. And you look at them on the plate and you're dumbfounded. They're just beautiful.
So that sort of raises one of the audience questions that came up. I think a lot of people reading Andy's books over time would say organic was really an important part of the decision-making process. But folks wanted to know, is it more important to optimize for local, or is it more important to optimize for organic? And how do you make that choice?
My preference would be to have local and organic, and that's what I will certainly push for. I think that there are a couple of considerations with organic. One is that, especially now that we have federal organic standards, which, by the way, you're also all going to have to fight to protect because there'll be constant efforts to weaken those and take them away. I think the great virtue there is that these foods are going to give you fewer residues of agrochemicals, and while there's a lot of debate about the health concerns with agrochemicals, the bottom line is they can't be good for you. So the only question is how bad they are. And I think probably in many cases pretty bad. And that being precautionary means finding ways to eat less of them. The practical problem is that for many people in this country, organic food is too expensive or it's not available, not accessible. I think it's important to inform yourself about which crops are most contaminated, and there are websites that give you that information. One of them is the Environmental Working Group in Washington, D.C., ewg.org, which periodically updates its list of the dirty dozen, the top 12 most contaminated crops. And in those instances, you make a decision, I make a decision not to eat conventional versions or only to eat organic versions if I can get them. The other big concern about organic, and this is something that Michael can talk about, is the environmental consequences of conventional farming versus organic farming. I think there are huge differences there, and that's more an impact on all of us and everyone, not just on immediate personal health.
Yeah, I agree with Andy that it's you want both. And it's kind of a false dichotomy. I think a little too much has been made of it. Time magazine ran that cover, you know, forget organic, buy local. And the first thing you need to realize is that very often local is organic, whether it's called that or not. There are now many local farmers who, because they're selling at farmers markets, don't feel the need to be certified. And it's also very expensive, time-consuming, lots of paperwork to be certified organic. So there are people who've dropped their certification or haven't bothered getting them. But it doesn't mean that they are suddenly dropping lots of agrochemicals on their farms. If you are a small, diversified farm, and this is key, because if you're in a local market, the odds are you're not growing one thing. It's not economically feasible to be doing a monoculture at the farmer's market. These farmers usually are doing a whole lot of different things. The chances are you don't need agrochemicals. I mean, if you have a diversified enough farm, your pesticides are really necessitated by monoculture by and large. There are exceptions. There are certain crops that are very hard to grow without chemicals unless you make a special effort, apples, for example. But so people sometimes will go to the farmer's market and they'll go to farmers and say, are you organic? And the farmer has to say no if he's not certified now, because it has a specific legal meaning. But it's actually the wrong question to ask them. If you are concerned about pesticides, and we all should be concerned about pesticides, the question is, what pesticides do you use? How do you fertilize your crops? What's your source of fertility? So you really want to have a kind of more extensive conversation. And the chances are good you're going to discover that that's food you're happy to eat, even though it's not technically organic. And there are a lot of other virtues to buying local food, and that there are times when, you know, I'm willing to put by the organic label and support local, because food is about a lot more than avoiding pesticides. You know, when you're buying organic, you are supporting a great many other values you may or may not hold. I'll just list a couple of them for you. One is you're protecting farmland in your community. You are keeping that belt around your cities or communities in agriculture. And for me, you know, that's a very important value, to keep farmers in my community, have them around. They add a lot to a community culturally, just in terms of the local knowledge they have. Buying locally gives me a lot